Countries across the world are ageing. We are living longer, but birth rates are falling, faster than expected. The UK will soon see more elderly people than young adults. It is the same in the US, with older adults more numerous than children by 2035. The population of Europe is forecast to fall by 175 million by the end of the century, with a sharp decline in the ratio of young workers to dependents. The dependency ratio will double in most advanced economies. This ageing population will cause lower economic growth, more government spending, and places pressure on already weak economies. The IMF predicts the effects of ageing will require a fall in consumption of up to 25% in China and 13% in the average high-income country. But is it really all bad news? And can we learn to thrive with ageing populations? Well, the first cost of an ageing population is more government spending. Not just higher pensions, but also higher healthcare spending too. Around 50% of healthcare spending comes in a person's last year of life. Healthcare as a share of GDP has been rising in the post-war period, but with an ageing population, it will have even further to rise. And it's not just the effect of ageing, but also all the advances in treatment and more diseases of modernity, which will require higher spending. But the impact is less spending elsewhere, higher taxes, and higher borrowing. Government debt has already been on the increase in recent years, and it could become unsustainable. But whilst we have more people receiving pensions, we have a shrinking base of workers to pay income tax. In the post-war period, the rise in life expectancy was fine because we could use economic growth to pay for more pension spending. But since 2010, global growth has slowed down quite sharply, and this raises concerns about whether we can deal with an ageing population in the future. UK pension spending as a share of GDP rose from 2% in 1950 to 8% in 2019. Italy already spends 16% of GDP, with France spending 14%. And this will continue to rise in the future. But will tax revenues be able to keep up? The problem is that an ageing population is of itself a major cause of slower economic growth. Let's take Japan. Japan's population was the first to age rapidly, and it has seen sclerotic economic growth for over 2 decades. When a population is aging, it reduces the incentive for business investment and innovation. The elderly spend relatively less on shopping, entertainment, and going out. Therefore, the need for big investment declines, and this can create a spiral of low growth, low investment, and low productivity. The problem is that workers have expectations of retiring at an early age, and when governments try to change this, it's often met with a backlash. Now, the UK has already raised its retirement age, and it has plans to raise it to 68, one of the highest in the developed world. But by contrast, France is facing massive protests from its plan to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. And the problem with raising the retirement age is that rising ill health is reducing the disability-free life expectancy of many. And this can vary tremendously by region, with healthy life expectancy ranging from 51 years in Blackpool to 71 in Richmond upon Thames. Now, in an ideal world, artificial intelligence and robots would be able to take the place of all the young workers. But in recent years, productivity growth has stalled and is much less than we would have hoped. As birth rates fall, this decline in the workforce is only going to get more dramatic. Now, the one very considerable benefit of this trend is a fall in unemployment. Often the scourge of Western economies, mass unemployment does seem to be a thing of the past. And with an ageing population, the young at least will have innumerable job opportunities. Now, another potential benefit of an ageing population is that a relative shortage of workers should put upward pressure on wages and increase the incentive for firms to invest and increase productivity. However, rather concerningly, this has not really happened in the past 13 years. Whilst corporate profit rates have increased, median wage growth has lagged behind. It's not just the UK which has reported a shortage of workers, but many countries in the developed world, and this will become more acute over time as the global population ages. And this will create an increasing incentive to encourage immigration, because this is ultimately the easiest solution to an aging population: attract migrants. But this itself has issues. Firstly, there are potential political issues to high rates of migration. But perhaps more concerningly is that in the future, as working populations decline, we could increasingly see a global fight for young skilled workers. In Britain, the Brexit debate was dominated by concern over high levels of migration. But in Eastern Europe, there is the other side of a coin, which is countries facing a mass exodus of young skilled workers, which exacerbates their own population declines. For an example, an estimated 8 million Romanians live outside their country. Labour flight is a real problem. Developing countries increasingly face a shortage of medical workers attracted overseas by higher wages and the developed world's need for skilled labour. Another important economic trend is that an ageing population has led to a decline in long-term real interest rates, and this has important implications for equity, property prices and savings. Basically, elderly people have higher levels of savings, and this excess demand for savings pushes down long-term real interest rates. We can see it in Japan, which has had close to zero interest rates since the mid-1990s. Now in 2023, interest rates did rise due to inflationary pressures, but in the long term, the trend is likely to be downward. And this move towards lower long-term real interest rates has a big effect on property prices. The Bank of England claimed that 90% of the rise in UK house price to income ratios between 1985 to 2018 was due to long-term interest rates. And ironically, this rise in property values benefited most those elderly property owners who saw a relative growth in wealth compared to young people. And this increase in the cost of living, partly related to low interest rates and the rise in wealth and house prices, is a concern, because whilst young people face higher tax burdens to pay for rising healthcare and pensions, they are facing stagnating real incomes and higher costs of living. And ironically, these costs of living pressures is in itself contributing to the ageing population, with economic factors and the high cost of living being a major factor behind declining fertility rates. However, whilst the UK has seen a rise in wealth inequality in recent decades, the Japanese experience also shows that when the ageing population magnifies and is combined with a shrinking population, there is a scope for a fall in land values and property prices. Since the 1990s, Japan has experienced a 60% fall in house prices, and although they have recovered somewhat since 2010, I think that if a European population does fall by 30% in the next century, it will have a major effect on property and land prices and could lead to cheaper asset prices in the long term. Now, whilst significantly cheaper house prices are not on the horizon for quite a long time, an ageing population and declining population will definitely fundamentally alter things like house prices, wages and land value. An ageing population will also lead to fundamental changes in spending patterns, which can affect the economy. There'll be more demand for social care, less demands for entertainment in the centre of town, and there is a risk that the social hubs of towns and cities can be affected unless a change in demographics can be catered for. The Economist highlighted this town in Japan, Toyama, which is adjusting to its ageing and falling population by turning old schools no longer needed into old folk centres and making the city smaller, denser, more compact and less car reliant. Another factor behind the ageing population in the West is that we will see big changes in global populations and changes in social, economic, political influence. The Western world will see declining populations, whilst sub-Saharan Africa, the one place with a high fertility rate, will continue to see a significant increase in population. This year, India's population exceeded China for the first time, and very soon China will see a dramatic drop in its population as its one-child family policy comes to fruition. The Russian population also faces a major decline, as life expectancy plummets due to COVID, the war, ill health, and this comes on top of one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. Now, we tend to see an ageing population through a negative light, but it is not all doom and gloom. Firstly, there is an issue of perception. Older people may be less dynamic physically, but can still offer much to society, either through part-time work, working later, or unpaid social care, e.g. grandparents offering childcare support. Old age can bring knowledge and wisdom useful to the labour force. President Biden shows that an octogenarian isn't necessarily past working, at least most of the time. A big issue is that the experience of old age can vary tremendously, depending on health and quality of life. A concern is that an ageing population, plus a rise in long-term sickness, which pushes people out of the labour force even before the statutory retirement age, will magnify the problem. But on the other hand, a more optimistic view is to look at the possibility of new technology to help give solutions to help provide social care and hopefully improve the quality of life in retirement, which in theory could raise the scope for people working later into life. One thing is for sure, an ageing population requires a very large change in attitudes and distribution of resources. So it creates a lot of pressures on society, but it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. Hope you like this video. If you do, please give it a thumbs up. See you soon.